Last year, when I attended CPAC undercover as a Trump supporter, I talked about the unhinged goals of Project 2025 and the mindless slavering support of Trump's most rabid base. I warned about the legislative agenda that, if Trump won, would be used to ostracize minority groups of all stripes while rolling back any regulations that might stop billionaire industrialists from ransacking the last shreds of American decency for their own pointless profit. You can go watch those videos, which I will link down below. And then nobody seemed to listen to me, and plenty of other people trying to sound the warning alarms. I mean, look, there's a lot of factors that contributed to this moment, but the bottom line is he's back. And when he won, I immediately made plans to be at the Capitol for the inauguration. After last election's January 6th insurrection, the proliferation of open white supremacist and street movements, and the sweeping changes Trump promised literally within days of taking office, I wanted to see from Trump supporters themselves what they thought of it all. What did the most die-hard Trump supporters think of taking over Greenland or RFK Jr.? Why would they buy into narratives about billionaires controlling their markets, information, news, and media, and then support this guy who surrounds himself with billionaires who control the markets, information, news, and media? Except this time, I wouldn't be going undercover. With the specter of Project 2025 looming large on the horizon, I resolved to be my authentic, queer, self. The goal was to have these people tell me in their own words why they wanted to take my healthcare away, why I was a danger to them, why I was worth personally legislating out of society. And I didn't get to ask almost any of it because the entire weekend was an uncoordinated nightmare on all sides. The entire weekend was a confusing mess, yet somehow the chaos and uncoordination made sense. Now, I had made plans to attend the Trump victory rally at the Capital One Arena the day before and the inauguration, but last-minute plans changed, leaving thousands without a way to see the inauguration as it was moved inside the Capitol Rotunda. Likewise, the Capitol Arena was a shit show, as I found out from streaming my time trying to simply find the end of the line to get in. I ended up finding it after almost an hour of walking, with less than an hour to the actual event starting. It's perhaps fitting that the heralding of Trump's new series of national disasters was rampant disorganization and chaos, so instead, I simply resolved to roll with it, tagging along where I could and trying to just see what people were saying and thinking. It was a bizarre journey that didn't reveal much I didn't already know. Trump's most loyal base, the ones who are willing to travel across the country to see him, is made up of largely sycophantic people who have been fed an endless stream of propaganda, and they relish the sweeping changes he promises because ultimately they either seem to revel in the suffering of others or are so insulated as to be oblivious to the groups being targeted, and that the promises being kept by Trump and his open fascist administration will likely harm them as well. Now, I did try to interview several Trump supporters, but whether because of interference or more likely the omnipresent loudspeaker noise population from endless Trump supporters blaring Lee Greenwood and the YMCA at all times, I was unable to use a lot of this footage because the audio was just blown out garbage. I did get a few interviews, including some questions for January 6 rioters who had been released, so you can look forward to that towards the end, I guess. But I quickly realized that my plans meant very little in the reality of what these few days were. A strange, surreal, and incredibly dark portent of things to come. As I mentioned, the first day I arrived, I was met with the realization that I wouldn't be attending the Capital One Arena victory rally. Thousands were unable to, but that didn't stop the street merchants from hawking the same hokey, cheap merchandise at bargain bin prices. These carnival barkers were everywhere you looked, with seemingly endless supplies of the same chintzy garbage. Not that it mattered to the crowds, who seemed to be buying it up in droves. This, despite the fact that there was a large section in the middle of the street that had been filled with discarded bags and belongings strewn about by Trump supporters who had been told they wouldn't be allowing bags into the arena. Small moments like this punctuated the whole experience, where I saw something so strange yet on the nose it could only be described as surreal. This endless drive for consumption, represented by the hucksters selling merch, representing a huckster who had grifted his way to the office once again with the aid of a billionaire who would do a Nazi salute that very day on the stage the president would speak on. And these people who had come all this way, waiting in cold and sleet to see them like they were rock stars, leaving nothing behind but garbage in their wake. Now, most of this first day would be simply observing the city around me, taking in the very odd sight of this massive capital where some of the most prominent sites had been blocked off. There were large swaths of the city that just felt abandoned, except for the large metal fences everywhere and military vehicles. I tried to listen into reactions in the crowd as I walked around. The big news of the day on social media, especially in more leftist spheres, was Elon Musk's Nazi salute. But none of the Trump supporters I overheard really even talked about it or brought it up. I overheard scattered conversations as people watched the speech on their phones, talking about how cute Elon's son was and how regal and elegant Melania is, and plenty of other rote pablum. Looking around at the day's end, the endeavor just kind of felt pointless. And in retrospect, that was the perfect prelude to my inaugural experience. The next day, I knew I wouldn't be going to the inauguration, but I didn't even really want to bother trying, because seemingly neither were plenty of other Trumpers. Watch parties, which had been planned, were suddenly a better-looking alternative to immerse myself in the mire of Trump supporters. And because I really wanted to get in there, I did the same thing I did last time. I spent way too much money on a ticket to a terrible event with bad food and lots of tacky outfits. Now, originally I went to this particular party in the hopes of interviewing some rumored Proud Boys who were supposed to show up there. But when I got there, I found out from a journalist friend that actually the Proud Boys were marching in the streets. So, not seeing any action where I was, I decided to go follow them instead. I live streamed nearly the whole thing, but eventually just lost interest and lost sight of the Proud Boys. To be honest, a Proud Boy march is just as sad and dumb as you might think, to witness these witless weekend warriors trample around, unironically yelling to non-existent Antifa forces that these streets were theirs. Antifa was consistently regarded as a genuine and ever-present threat during my time in DC, and I was even accused of being an Antifa agitator and thrown out of a crowd by January 6ers, but that comes a little bit later. There were two counter-protesters, just two, at the Proud Boy March, who did an admirable job irritating and impeding the Midlife Crisis Boys Club, mostly with an irritating droning siren and the enviable ability to shout these dorks down for hours on end. Kudos to them. I have no doubts that were there no cops present to at least provide the illusion of consequence, the Proud Boys would have gotten very violent with them. It's very obviously what they wanted. The person I will not give kudos to was the only other notable person I saw at the Proud Boy gathering. And that was this woman who I first saw seemingly preparing to wear blackface, brandishing an anarcho-capitalist flag emblazoned with a swastika and words I couldn't make out. Eventually, she would get into an argument with one of the counter-protesters and proceeded to call her several anti-Semitic slurs. And when she was called a Nazi, she unironically said, "Oh, so everyone you don't like is a Nazi."
Front door. Get out, Nazis! Get out! Oh, yes, a Nazi! A Nazi is anyone I disagree with! A Nazi is someone! Get out! Oh, that's unfortunate too, because you can't take a fucking joke. You can't perceive past your small frame of mind. It's acceptable in this country. This country is founded upon freedom of association.
Now, this little wonderful ball of sunshine is Rachel Siegel, a free thinker who's shown up to events like this in the past, sometimes with Nazi femboys in tow. Her only goal there seems to be incensing others by yelling her nonsensical worldview through a megaphone and calling people slurs when they understandably get mad. She, will call Jewish people the N-word or something. And after a while, it became clear that the Proud Boys barely seemed to know what they were doing there. They occasionally muttered about a planned Antifa opposition, but there wasn't one. They were just marching around proclaiming their victory, but nobody seemed to listen or care aside from the counter-protesters who wanted to prod and poke at the cartoonish, buffoonish spectacle. I went back to the event center where I had paid $200 for my ticket because once the actual inauguration ceremony was finished being watched, they had a series of live performers, and I didn't want to miss that. Now, you might not think there's anything worth a $200 ticket to a MAGA celebration event, and normally I'd agree with you. I missed the buffet, I still had to pay for my drinks, and when I got there, I was met with just a live Spanish language band that was serviceable, if ill-suited to a room of predominantly white people praising the mass expulsion of Latinos from the country. I was also still wearing a full face of makeup, and while I did take off some winter clothes because I'm not going to travel 1,000 miles and not serve cunt, I still very much obviously didn't belong there. So I had things like the staff asking to see my wristband and even searching my bag. But then something happened that almost made the tribulations worth it. A conservative comedian took the stage that is, and I say this without exaggeration, one of the worst comedians I have ever seen.
But we love the new Green Deal, don't we? We love the new Green Deal. Don't we love the new Green Deal? You know what I think of when I think of the new Green Deal? I think of driving to Palm Springs on the 10 freeway and seeing hundreds of windmills. But I'm pretty sure those are all socialist windmills because while they're all paid for, most of them aren't working.
Like he was in a room full of people who completely agreed with his every word on a day when they were all half drunk and celebrating Trump's win, and he still barely bombed on stage. Just watch.
No, I actually heard where there was supposed to be some protesters at this event tonight, and I look out and I don't see any protesters, and I'm thinking, where's all the protesters? And then it dawned on me, they don't accept EBT cards at this venue.
Now, after a while of recording, one woman came over to ask me if I was enjoying it, and I answered honestly and said, no.
Advice. So run, ho, run. Let's give her a shot. The resume's thin, but she's all they've got.
You're just a liberal. Check it in, right?
And now for the epilogue, because we all know how this
Less because it was conservative comedy, and more because it barely resembled comedy to begin with. And quickly, she asked if I was a liberal, to which I said, nar. And I don't think she heard me, but then another guy chimed in, and another woman joined the fray, and they basically flanked me on three sides, and I couldn't make out what they were saying. One seemed to be trying to agitate me, one was telling me not to go to the women's restroom, and another was honestly a little too drunk for me to make out what she was getting at. So, overwhelmed, I got up and went to get a drink as the comedy act ended, hoping to leave them behind me. I sat at a bar nearby and had a polite conversation about whiskey and old fashions with a mom next to me whose young daughter was climbing the bar like a jungle gym. It was perfectly polite, even pleasant conversation, so much that one could be forgiven for forgetting that as this trans person was talking with this MAGA person, Trump was getting ready to sign an executive order, stripping me of my legal recognition of personhood and self-determination. Then after a while, one of the three people came back to the bar and reiterated to me that I shouldn't go in the women's restroom. She had this matter-of-fact tone that came off less as a threat and more as just a promise that if I tried to use a woman's restroom, I would probably be assaulted by bystanders. She seemed to regard it as though she was telling me if I walked out in the rain, I'd just get wet. And my response to this was, I can't. All of the restrooms here are unisex, which was true. But seeing as there was a momentary lull in the music, I took the opportunity to sit down with this person and actually have an interview that wasn't being drowned out by the village people. And I did my best to be polite while still poking a bit at why she was a fervent enough Trump supporter to travel to D.C. and attend these events.
So, who am I here with really quick?
My name is Colleen Dubkowski. Originally escaped Connecticut. I was a activist against Parents' Choice and Take Back Connecticut in hopes of, against masking mandates and protection of children. And I moved to Tennessee. Here visiting my family.
Okay. Yeah, you were just telling me, we're here at the Trump kind of celebration dinner. You're a Trump supporter, I take it. Okay. What do you hope he focuses on first in office?
Protecting the border, because I think all Americans need to be protected against crime.
And you were just telling me about the modern media landscape, how things in media have changed because the people with money don't want the narrative controlled by the rest of the people, which is something I agree with. But I'm curious what you think about then people like Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg being so close to Trump and his administration.
Well, you have to remember, Mark Zuckerberg was tagged and pushed to censor information. In fact, I worked on 3 campaigns in Connecticut, and I got banned from Facebook permanently because of what I was saying, making awareness about masking, and that it should be a choice, and that vaccines should be a choice, and you shouldn't have to be mandated to do those things, and that's what freedom stands for. Mark Zuckerberg is just recently coming across it that way. But what I say is the freedom of market is, you you got you're a YouTuber, right? You get to use the facility and say your freedom. You get to use X and say what we think. You got Rumble. There's gonna always be a collection of new things coming, and if you don't like what's there, find a way to get investors and create your own. It's the beauty of the market.
I was wondering, what are your opinions on if you know about the new Trump coin that Trump just launched as a cryptocurrency?
I don't know enough about it, but he's a businessman, and I know people like to point out that he's failed. You know, most people fail at a lot of things before they become better. That's what makes us humans. That's what makes us, grow as individuals. But I don't know enough about it to speak on it, so I'm not going to really.
Well, I guess what I'm really getting at there is because, again, as somebody who has a very basic understanding of cryptocurrency, how it works, but a lot of the value, it went up very quickly and then was sold off and then went down very steeply. And a lot of people look at something like that and Trump, or at the very least the Trump brand, being able to profit off of it. And my question for you is between things like Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy having the Doge department, and the fact that Trump's cabinet now has the most billionaires of any cabinet, people who will be integral in legislating the laws of the land. I agree with you that companies and billionaires shouldn't have sway over things like the media, but I'm just curious about your thoughts about these billionaires who have sway over things like companies and the media.
Well, we also have to remember that with politicians, no matter what, there are billionaires, there are influencers, because they have the money, they can make the donations. And you got George Soros, you got Mark Cuban, you got Hollywood that backs, a lot of the politicians on the left. It goes both ways. I actually think that people are starting to realize, and what people don't understand what MAGA really means, is that it's about us collectively. We should have the power no matter what. And some people would claim, like, oh, we're cults and we would follow this billionaire or that billionaire, and that's not the truth. We let them represent us, but MAGA is bigger than they are. They don't succeed without the collective. We're the collective people. If we decide that we don't like what you're saying, we're going to call you out. There was a big debate going about
H-1B visas.
Yes. And some people agree with it. I mean, it is a complicated thing. It's not one or the other. You'll find that within us, we will debate each other. And we don't just worship you.
After I put my phone away, we continued speaking. See, she could obviously tell I was trans because I wasn't exactly hiding it. We began to talk a bit about social issues such as veterans housing, and I explained to her why we need universal basic housing, explaining that it wasn't a measure for socialism and free stuff, but a step towards a more productive, happy society instead of wasting the massive amount of housing we have sitting empty right now. And we came to actually agree on these things throughout this talk. And eventually we were pushed upstairs, and I met with a journalist friend. The bar idea overall had been a bit of a bust. The Proud Boys never showed up for some raucous party. It was just a bunch of middle-aged people huddling around TVs in a bar and cheering when Trump came on the TV. Like, people aren't joking when they say it's like Cocomelon for adults. However, when I ran into the lady I interviewed again, the most fascinating thing happened. She introduced me to some of her friends who were at the party, and the interesting thing is, she started using different pronouns. See, when she first called me out when I was recording The Comedian, she just used he. Conservatives do this a lot, which is like a on principle, recognizing biological reality thing that they like to do or whatever. But then she started using she pronouns and later referred to me as them. Not because I think she knew I used they, them pronouns, but because I had never really mentioned it or clarified, and I think she wanted to at least show me a little bit more respect. And to me, this was a fascinating interaction. It was a microcosm of the same phenomenon I talked about in the documentary about de-radicalizing from hate groups. Check out that video if you haven't. When you're able to crack somebody's approach to a person or group by just introducing them to a person from that group, without the guile or propaganda that media like Libs of TikTok and Matt Walsh like to filter trans people through to the conservative audience. Anyway, it was getting dark and cold, and I had another lead. As Trump began to sign his executive orders, the families of the January 6 rioters that had been jailed for their part in the Capitol insurrection prepared for immediate release. As I left, I saw some of the bar crowd go into the abandoned and freezing DC streets to spread out what they called the world's biggest Trump flag. They just went outside to flap this massive flag that's like the size of a city intersection up and down. There was nobody around, nobody watching, just flapping for love of the game, I guess. So, here's that. Then I attempted to make my way to the DC detention facility where media was gathering. The problem is that DC was locked down from car traffic for the planned parade that didn't end up happening where it was planned. Yet the barricades were still up, likely preventative measures in case anyone attempted to riot, except there weren't a lot of gaps, meaning I spent about an hour walking over a mile just to get out of what was essentially a large transparent maze. I could always see where I needed to go through the great barricades, but had to walk through large sections of the National Mall to get there, then walk back around the other way. And there was almost nobody in sight except for bored National Guardsmen who just didn't seem to also know what the hell was going on. Around this time, the temperature had also dropped to around 15 degrees. I was pissed and cold. Now, eventually I got out of the no-car zone and was able to Uber the rest of the way to a detention facility where I saw some very colorful protesters, that color primarily being red. I also saw Ryan Sanchez and his entourage of Groyper dorks, who you may remember from my CPAC video as the Nazi who Nazi saluted on investigative journalist Amanda Moore, who was also there. I'm not sure if Ryan just didn't see my makeup, because he didn't like call me a slur or anything. He just kept referring to me as his Aryan brother, to which I reminded him,
No.
My white brother?
Your last name is Sanchez.
But this is getting a little ahead of myself. I was streaming this and simply walking around minding my own business, hovering near the MAGA folks who were preemptively celebrating the J6's release. Listening to one of them talk to family, I overheard another conversation about how regal and elegant Melania was at the election.
So what was your favorite part of Inauguration?
Well, my favorite part was watching our beautiful, elegant First Lady. She is untouchable in her elegance and grace, the way she carries.
Eventually, I just wandered, but I was stopped by a J6 supporter straight from Central Casting with the operator beard and opposite of a body to match, covered in all the quality flannel Walmart had to offer. And you know what? I hope he watches this. Fuck you, guy. So he came over, got in my space, and without a word, literally shooed me. Like,
You should be on the other side.
What? I'm not doing anything. I'm not causing any problems. Why? You don't even know who am I? What do you know about me? Come on, like what do you know about me?
You gotta earn it.
I'm not doing anything. I'm good.
You have bad
I'm good.
I don't know if I can
I'm good.
Get on the other side.
I'm good.
Dude, you can record me all you want. I'm telling you, you need to be on the other side.
Why?
Yeah, come over here.
Give me a good reason.
I won't bite too hard.
Why do I need to be on the other side?
You need to be on the other side.
Why? Why do I need to be on the other side?
Why can't you play nice like El Reeve or Amanda?
There we go. Didn't give me a reason.
I had no idea what he wanted, so I just ignored him and told him, no, I'm good. He wandered off for a bit, likely to talk to somebody else, when one of the Groyper-looking teenagers tried to shoulder check me. I just avoided it and said something. I tried my best to isolate the audio, but I'm pretty sure he just called me a
Say it one more again?
So, naturally, wearing a face full of makeup in the middle of a crowd who celebrated the January 6th insurrection, I didn't really hesitate to respond. And it was at this exact time that the big guy came back, despite the fact that I wasn't talking to him, and started yelling at me, calling me Antifa.
One more time, Antifa, get on the other side of the cops line.
Well,
one of my best friends.
I'm just sitting here.
He got rolled up all this, and
I also wasn't talking to you. I was talking to him.
my comrade here told me.
You're Antifa. You need to get on the other side of the fucking
releasing
line.
prisoners.
What do you know about me?
You're Antifa, and you need to go on the other side of the fucking police line.
What makes you think I'm Antifa?
You're Antifa, you need to go on the other side of the police
You
line.
need to move
You
back.
gotta do a little more
Move
digging.
back.
Hey, get on the other
How
side.
am I Antifa?
Hey, get on the other side of the police line,
You know
bro.
what? Here, I'm gonna go talk to the police real
Go
quick.
talk to them. Be on the other side.
You've seen me literally standing here doing nothing.
Antifa,
Come
get
up to me.
on the other
This is
side
my-
of the police line.
Like y'all saw them come up to me when I was doing nothing.
Antifa, get on the other side of the police
You do
line.
not need no agitators.
Hey, this guy's
I'm
Antifa.
literally not
Or this
doing
it.
anything.
He, she, it, they, them, whatever.
I knew they thought Antifa was like a real thing, a real threat. But more on that later. Until this point, I had remained incredibly quiet, respectful, and I wasn't agitating anything. That didn't stop me from suddenly being harangued from multiple angles, people yelling at me that I was an Antifa supporter and needed to be removed. I tried to explain to the bike cops watching, who had been watching the whole thing, but the folks who were literally supporting the January 6ers as just expressing their free speech got me kicked out of their group for doing nothing.
Cool. Antifa, go on the other side. There you go.
Have a good day.
Good hit. Good hit. Good hit.
However, this wouldn't be the end of my experience because some of the chuckleheads decided they want to just, I guess, joke about doing insurrection on the detention facility itself. Like, they were just getting impatient with the Trump pardons and the lack of clarity on when and if the J6ers would be released that night. So they all decided to cross the street to basically go huddle up against the front entrance in a very obvious attempt at an intimidation tactic. And shout out to this one bike cop. As the other officers ran to meet the protesters, had to yell, "Don't forget your bikes. We're a bike unit." So naturally, I decided to go jump up on a flagpole and get in the middle of the whole thing. Like the Proud Boys the same day, I didn't think they had much of a plan aside from just standing around and trying to intimidate people. Even people in the group were yelling about how they weren't going to do a January 6th on the jail. Now, eventually, the police did push everybody back, and the powder keg was relatively diffused. After a while, a White House envoy came to tell everyone they were still working to process the pardons, and likely nobody would be released until the next day. And so I went home. And as I scrolled through the news, I think it all finally began to set in. Seeing the billionaires already beginning to tailor social media algorithms to push conservatism, seeing no meaningful pushback or really statements from prominent Democrat leadership on Trump's ban on gender ideology, which will end in danger for trans Americans. And that's not even talking about the massive rollbacks of executive orders aimed at stopping discrimination in hiring and housing, all done in the name of fighting wokeness and DEI. Things that have been buzzwords for about 5 fucking minutes, while these measures have helped society for decades. I saw all these things all at once. Like he promised, like Project 2025 had planned years in advance, they were unrolling sweeping measures to restructure America to something that represented everything I had been walking through and witnessing over the past few days. Uncoordinated, stupid chaos. Like plenty of Americans at that point, I felt hopeless, but not defeated. And something would happen the next day, on my last day in Washington, D.C., that is why I left feeling hopeful. Now, having almost none of the interview footage I came for, I resolved to go back to the detention facility the next day as J6 riders were being released. It was another in a constant stream of dreamlike scenes during my time there, as people who had been jailed for Trump told cameras they'd absolutely do it again if he asked, and people continually conflated Trump and religion, entwining the now president as an integral part of God's plan.
I don't agree with everything that President Trump says, but when he said that there was problems with the election, I agree with that. I saw it firsthand as an election worker. So I said at the time, before I was charged, when I knew it was coming, that if there was another election rally in D.C., I would go.
I hovered a bit as the released January 6ers talked to the media. One woman who was a nonviolent offender that simply walked into the Capitol talked about how she was excited to take her kids to sports practice now that she was out. And for people like this, I do have a modicum of sympathy. After hearing her describe the terrible prison conditions they went through, I was curious. See, while plenty of Americans daily are incarcerated for minor offenses, rarely do they come from this kind of background. Middle, maybe upper class, white, middle-aged, having kids, incarcerated in a federal facility. I think one of the primary reasons the MAGA base has rallied around the J6 protesters is because being incarcerated for shitty charges is new to a lot of the weekend warrior and middle-class Trump voters. However, to plenty of other groups, including people of color and impoverished communities, there's very little notable about this. They did a crime, they were doing time. I was more curious if that time on the inside inspired any consideration for the horrible conditions in the federal prison system, where things are often poorly staffed, underfunded, and can be intensively abusive, particularly to women inmates. So I asked.
I'll tell you the 5 things that I told my judge the other day in court. We're forced to house with sex-offending biological male inmates, and to go into detail, this means if you're a woman and you're put in a cell with one and you refuse to house with him, you'll be thrown in the shoe, very possibly.
And that's, for those who don't know, that's solitary confinement?
It's not necessarily.
Not necessarily.
It's with another person, but you never get out of the cell. The conditions are just really terrible and abusive.
Okay.
It's not a place you want to go. The showers are cold, multiple buildings with no hot water at Hazleton. Here, the showers just leak. They're in ill repair, tiles falling off, water flows out onto the tile. The roofs in Hazleton, they leak so bad that you have to put out garbage cans to catch the water. The water would flow down the walls, excuse me, hitting fire alarms sometimes and setting the fire alarms off. I had a cell that dripped every time it rained. It just dripped, which of course creates mold. I had ceiling tiles fall off around me in the video visit room before because of the leaking ceilings. Medical was basically non-existent. I knew a woman in the last year with multiple sclerosis that was not treated until it was so bad they had to take her to the hospital and bring her back to life. I was bunkies with an elderly woman, Nancy, who they knew had a blockage and they didn't treat it. For a full year, they didn't treat her blockage. And then when she went into a diabetic coma because they weren't treating her diabetes, the blockage went and she had a heart attack and she had to be revived at the hospital.
And you mean they didn't have the staff on hand to handle those medical emergencies?
Whether it's a lack of staff or it's a lack of care, I don't know.
Okay.
Why does it take 2 weeks to get a simple antibiotic in prison? I don't know. Shelley Stallings, another J6 woman, she had to fight for cancer treatment even though they knew she had breast cancer when she went in. In visiting at Hazleton, they told me in orientation, do not have your family come visit you here. My family came to visit me anyways, and for the first 6 months, they came to visit me once a week. For the first 6 months, I got an extra, unnecessary, improperly done strip search, and I was refused a lunch. Why is this happening? Why?
Well, and this is very similar to the stories of standards that I've heard from other J6ers, from other prisoners. Do you think that after y'all have gone through so much on the inside, seeing the prison system firsthand, that the J6 group, the families, might start trying to lobby or move towards pushing for prison reform or prison reform measures?
I believe that God allowed us to be put through this so we could see the corruption with our own eyes, because until you see it and experience it, you can't change it. And I believe God is shining a light down on this country so we can see the things that needed to be changed, and now we can start changing them. So absolutely, 100% yes, yes, yes. And we are going to work on reform. I am not going to forget the women in the prison that I've had to leave behind, and we're going to fix this.
Now, I have no reason not to take Rachel at her word. Naturally, the idea of protesting bunking with a trans woman and that resulting in time in some kind of solitary strikes me as a bit off. It felt like another opportunity to use her story to push the conservative agenda, and it falls in line almost word for word with the same turf logic that conservative media has adopted. But is it based in reality? Of course not. This study, which interviewed former inmates from both men's and women's prisons, found that in all female populations, the prevalence of inmate-on-inmate sexual assault was 2 times higher than that for men. 21.2% of the women interviewed said they'd been assaulted in the last 6 months. The terrible reality of the carceral system is that it encourages abuse and inhumane treatment, even among prisoners. And that abuse happens with or without the presence of trans people. There's no research or data I could find to suggest that housing trans women who are nonviolent offenders with an all-woman population increases the chance of violence towards other women in prison. An estimate from the Williams Institute puts transgender inmates at roughly 0.24% of inmates nationwide, which means that even if you compare that, and I realize this isn't exact, but randomized, even 0.24 of the 1,000 surveyed doesn't come close to a rate of 21.2%, and that's assuming that population of 1,000 people surveyed would have literally every statistical trans woman possible. Now, this isn't concrete, obviously, and certainly isn't stable enough to draw a conclusion that women are endangered with or without trans women in the population, but I'm hoping it gives an idea that the problem with violence against women isn't trans women, but the system itself. And like literally any other group, yeah, I'm sure there are trans women who are sexual assaulters or violent offenders, and I don't think they should be put into men's prisons. I do think they shouldn't be in general population like any other high-risk offender. Like, should a senior who's in prison for tax fraud or smoking weed be forced to bunk with someone who's a repeat offender, convicted rapist, or murderer? No, but that should be common sense regardless of gender identity or sex at birth. But the alternative, which this woman advocates for, and Trump just signed into office, is far more inhumane than just having a trans woman be in prison and that making somebody uncomfortable because of their bigoted biases. Since Trump's order on sending trans women to men's prisons, you may have seen something floating around on social media about V-coding. For those who don't know, it is a widespread practice for prison guards and management to essentially give trans women inmates to certain men as a form of violence prevention. I cannot say this clearly enough. I'm not going to sugarcoat it for the algorithm or for saving this video's ad revenue. The United States government now mandates that trans women will be sent to men's facilities, and we know that when they arrive, they will be subject to continual, constant rape and torture. Some stories from trans inmates have attested to being sexually assaulted nearly every day, sometimes multiple times a day. We have proof that this happens. We know it happens, and no matter what crime they committed, nobody in a general population deserves this inhumane treatment. The prison system is inhumane as it is, and it strikes me as so incredibly hollow, just beyond ignorant, to pay lip service to those horrid conditions while essentially advocating to continue targeting dehumanization of a marginalized and already targeted group. I may do a full video going deeper into this issue to give it the proper gravity it deserves because I don't have time to give it the in-depth analysis it deserves here. Now, after talking to her, I put the perfect little capstone on my time in DC. I spoke with Robert Moores, a former Army Ranger who had been sentenced to 5 years for his role in the Capitol insurrection. While I had a bit more sympathy for Rachel's incarceration, despite her shitty takes on trans women, I have very little sympathy for Robert. The entire time I listened to him answer questions from the media, this person who had been incarcerated for assaulting Capitol police officers spewed an unfiltered stream of Alex Jones-level conspiracies, including about Antifa lieutenants from Portland being at the inauguration that day.
There was 200 informants in the crowd that day. We know for a fact, based off of Cowboy Logic's interviews that they did on Real America's Voice, that a lieutenant from Antifa from Portland, Oregon confirmed that he had under 200 people from his own little battalion there that day as well. So there's a bunch of different players. We also have the hotel receipts and the flight tickets of a Ukrainian Azov brigade that was amongst us disguised as well. So there was a lot.
There are absolutely a ton of conspiracists out there saying Antifa was actually behind this. And they've all been debunked when it turns out the people changing clothes were actually just like Trump supporters trying not to be recognized when they entered the Capitol. It's these fervent and violent offenders that should give everyone pause right now, like former Proud Boy leader Enrique Tarrio, who's talking about revenge now. And when I saw Robert, I couldn't help but think about the wandering Proud Boys earlier, looking for any fight they could find, even if it wasn't waiting for them. And then the man the night before who accused me entirely unprompted of being Antifa. It doesn't take an engineer to cross these wires to see an outcome where someone is simply singled out as Antifa, something that doesn't exist in any organized group and so can't be proven, and that person is targeted for revenge. I also don't think it's a coincidence that as these right-wing street movements feel emboldened as conservatives move to broadly define Antifa, which is not an organization, as a domestic terror group. Again, it's not hard to see the potential and likely outcome that any protester who isn't right-wing can be arrested, imprisoned, and not given proper access to a trial because they are arbitrarily labeled as a terrorist. And now, for trans people, the danger is even worse, as they'll be explicitly sent to improper prison facilities where they'll be sexually assaulted, tortured, and worse. What do you think should be done about, then, the kind of the Marxists or the communists or the people working against America's government from the inside, the people who were behind legislating lawfare against Trump, against the administration?
Yeah. Well, see, and this is what makes our job so difficult, because if we were to say, get rid of them, deport them, exile them or whatever, then we're no better than them. So what actually needs to happen is we change the hearts and minds of individuals. It boils down to education.
Okay.
Let's talk about how Marxism has never worked in any country it's ever been established or adopted in.
Okay.
Let's talk about how the millions of people that have died because of communism in places like China, in places like Russia, in places like Laos. Let's talk about those things. Let's talk about how these policies aren't based off of equality of opportunity, but equity of outcome, which means that everybody's going to suffer the exact same rate. So I think it boils down to education, and I honestly think, things like Turning Point, PragerU, these are going to be our best avenues of approach to try to educate and update the mind of the Americans so that they make better choices for the future. Because you can't use violence unless in defense, because otherwise it makes you just as bad as the people that you're trying to condemn. So it's a tough battle ahead. It requires a lot of patience.
From a distance, it might have been funny to see Robert spouting this conspiratorial nonsense. But it was a perfect end to my MAGA inauguration experience, because just under the easily insultable exterior is a promise of uncoordinated violence and retribution. And it's only a matter of time until the people who were pardoned are back to doing violence against someone else. I can't help but wonder if those same people will even be charged if they assault someone in the street, as long as they can claim it was Antifa. Like anyone who wasn't a white nationalist or just an insulated, wealthy, middle-class person, I was incredibly stressed, exhausted, annoyed, and the cold weather hadn't helped my irritability. Seeing Robert there, free and speaking unfounded conspiracies, surrounded by people who praised the violent insurrection and would do it again, and suddenly the trip didn't just feel helpless, but pointless. I had traveled to Washington, D.C. in the name of investigative journalism to get the story on the ground, show how ignorant and misinformed the people leading America to slaughter were. And I had to ask, why? Because before it felt like if someone was watching them, they could be exposed. I hoped, perhaps naively, with videos like the CPAC one, I could call attention to these issues that might convince people, but now I wondered, who even cared? Like many other Americans, I tried to put it out of my head for the night. I had one more plan before I left DC. I met up with a trans friend I made last time I was there, and they were going to take me to a cute little gay bar in DC. I threw on what could loosely be called a cute outfit and did my makeup once again, and made up my mind that I was going to try and have a good night. And just going to a gay bar was without a doubt the best time I had in days. A highlight of my trip, even though that isn't a very high bar to clear. For the first time in days, I didn't have to keep my head on a swivel for anyone who might threaten me because I wore makeup. I didn't have to ask to be referred to with dignity or respect, and for once that week, the drinks were reasonably priced and not watered down to shit. And to my surprise, several people at the bar recognized me from my channel. And sometimes that can be a little weird, because people can watch hundreds of hours of my content and know so much about me and I know nothing about them. But here, I never felt that disconnect. Even if I didn't know their names or who they were personally, I knew them. I was among friends, among a community. Even in this wonderfully limp-wristed establishment, The conversation was, naturally, about everything in the inauguration. The road closures. Did you hear this? Trump already signed that. That same fog of apprehension, maybe dread, was as tangible around us as pouring rain. It covered us, and we all felt it. And after 2 sappically named lavender cocktails, I had a moment of clarity. As I looked around at the smiling, laughing queers of various backgrounds, colors, pronouns, I just remember thinking, they can't take this away. And it was then that I pulled out my phone. Something written on a wall caught my eye, and the lights of an empty room beyond caught my attention. For just a few hours, I felt safe, comfortable for the first time in days. Time around community, time connecting to others, remembering why I did this was just what I needed. I didn't come to DC to go to a Trump rally, to Proud Boy marches, and get yelled at by January 6ers in the hopes that I could convince people they were bad. I was there in femme clothing and full makeup to let them know I wasn't afraid. I was going to be as queer and in the open as possible, even as they signed executive orders that tried to strip me of my determination and sense of self. It didn't matter. It wouldn't work because I wasn't alone. I thought about a famous quote from Mr. Rogers. In a book, he was talking about how parents can talk to kids about dangerous situations and to tell the kids they should look for the helpers. You will always find people who are helping. Most of us feel scared, but none of us are alone right now. It might feel that way, but it's not. People have asked me before, what can I do to be more active? And I've always said, find a local group. Look into student political activist groups, local democratic and socialist groups, because they often have ties to local community outreach and organizing. In the past, I would agree with Mr. Rogers that you had to look for the helpers, but it's not enough. If there's not an activist group near you, nobody pushing and representing your communities in the face of an oncoming avalanche of discrimination at every level, you need to be the helper. Find others like you on social media, Discord, Signal. Organize not just for marches, not just for demonstrations, but for helping others in your communities. Find or form networks of mutual aid across gender, identity, race, and religious lines. Nobody knows what will happen next, but every day it looks more like food insecurity, housing insecurity, and medical necessities will become harder for everyone. And to get through whatever happens next, we need to find our spaces, keep them safe, and keep them strong, and protect those who need it most. And I'm not just talking about in the LGBTQ community, but every community. I am tired. So many other people are too, but you don't owe it just to yourself to keep fighting, to keep pushing back against everything that wants to deprive you of your right to be. You owe it to the generations of people who have fought, bled, and died for the rights of others that are being stripped away right now. So rest up for now. Get a clear head, come up with a plan, and then follow through. Find your community, find your spaces, and find a way to help others and help each other. Hello, everybody, and thank you for watching. And I hope that this ending note of hope will inspire some of you to either take action or talk to others about taking action. I've talked a bit about it in some of my recent streams, but I truly believe that community-based action and organization is what we need right now. And no matter what your level or ability, there is a place for you if you go looking. And if you can't find that space, don't be afraid to make it yourself, because I guarantee you will find others just like you. Things have understandably felt pretty heavy, so I'm going to be alternating content a bit, taking some breaks from heavy issues for more lighthearted content, focusing on news and debunking misinformation during streams. I would like to continue doing on-the-ground investigative reporting and documentary work like this, because I believe we are going to need more left-leaning journalism as major media outlets begin to cower to the conservative regime. If you'd like to help me, links to donate funds are down below, and you can check out my Patreon to join these groovy folks you see here and join the Dead Domain Discord. As always, thank you for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful day.